What is genealogy? Genealogy is the field of research that studies the origins and descent of families. It identifies the individuals in a family, and it also places a family in its historical setting, and it tries to reconstruct the lives of family members from records as much as possible. In recent years, more and more academic historians have turned to genealogy for the contribution it can make. Historical research looks at the big picture, but studying families helps historians understand some of the smaller details of that big picture. Like, I've used examples, documents in the historical marker from Thomas Marion Mountain Tom Clark, the outlaw allegedly buried under East Tennessee Street outside the city cemetery. Wade Pruitt did the best job he could, but he didn't have a lot of the historical sources available to him in the late 1970s when he was writing his book. So there's actually way more historical records on Tom Clark than I thought going into it, which I'm actually researching a biography on Tom. And so that has helped a lot in figuring out what made Tom tick and putting him into his historical and social and other military contexts. Now, a long time ago, 50, 100 years ago, genealogy depended largely on oral tradition. My grandmother said her great-great-great-grandfather rode with George Washington. And if you were a member of society, then you could almost be taken at your word and get in one of the lineage societies. But, and it was oral tradition, undocumented materials, and of course, its reputation was less than reputable. Because how do you know any of that is accurate? It may be, but if you don't have any documentation, which if there's one thing that you take away from this course today is documentation. You have to try to get copies of all of the documents that you find. And I've put some of them on here, examples of some types of documents from some of my own family archives at home. So you'll want to make digital scans of these, and in some case, what I like to do is make good printed copies and put them in a binder, which I forgot to bring one of those, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then you can make digital scans and have them, because if you do put them on the internet, do digital scans, just make sure you back them up, because the first time your hard drive crashes and you don't have them backed up. So a good example of a work based primarily on oral history is, as I said, Maurice Pruitt's Booger Saga. He used mainly oral sources that he heard from his aunts, uncles, and grandparents. And I'm really glad he recorded those stories. And in one edition of the book, they published a Times Daily interview with him where he basically said, "I'm sorry if I haven't gotten the stories exactly right, but that's the way I remember hearing them tell them." So he says, he's basing his book on folklore. And I'm glad he recorded that folklore. But it's important to try to differentiate as much as possible between fact and folklore. So the basic methods of genealogical research are the collection, interpretation, analysis, and evaluation of genealogy information, which may sound really technical, but it's not. The basic items of genealogical information are the dates and places of the events that establish personal identities and family relationships. For example, Thomas Marion Clark to Sarah Bradford, they got married September 25th, 1847 in Franklin County, Tennessee in 1847, and J.S. Green, Justice of the Peace, did the marriage ceremony. So it establishes dates and places for events like marriages, for military service, for deaths, births. So how do you actually get started? Well, start with the known, what do I know, and work towards the unknown. Start with now and work backwards. Dr. Darrell Russell had a student in his basic genealogy class that I used to help him teach with Brian Newton 20 years ago, and this little guy named Mr. Kroll said, I can't start with me and go backwards. I have to start in 1790. And, of course, if you've got an ancestor named John Smith and you start in 1790, how do you know which John Smith? So anyway, you determine what materials might be the best sources of the genealogical information required to solve the problem. what documents are going to answer the genealogy question I have about this ancestor or those ancestors. If you can't find the primary documents, are there any other materials that I can find that might answer my question? Then where are those located? Can I get them online? Do I have to go to an archives or courthouse? Then, as I said, make Xerox copies, or if you can't or don't have time to, or don't have, quarters or dimes to Xerox, you can transcribe, make a word-for-word copy, or abstract, summarize the evidence. Just make sure you cite the sources, like if you do transcribe it or summarize it, note where it came from, like Lauderdale County Will Book A, page 398. Then you interpret the evidence and the sources, put this with any other evidence that you might have, and see if it makes sense. If there's any discrepancies, try to work those out. And you don't have to do number 7. Some professional genealogists recommend this, but I don't think you necessarily have to do this. You can do it in your mind. Just be a critical thinker and don't just accept what anyone says. And as I said, start with now and go backwards. So you want to start with your parents or grandparents and work backwards a generation at a time. Now, Brian Newton, who's president of the Genealogical Society and a friend of mine, says start with you. So if you can find documents on yourself, like your birth certificate and stuff like that, go ahead and do that. But it's easier to find records on people that have been dead, 100 years than it is for people that are still living because of privacy reasons. So it really does help to start with your parents or grandparents and work backwards a generation at a time. And as I said, always document your research. You'll see when we get up to Ancestry and Family Search that a lot of their member family trees have no documentation. So they may be 100% accurate, but there's no way of knowing until you have documents that you can check. So it really helps to document your sources. And if I had $1 for every time I've heard great-great-grandpa was a Cherokee chief and great-great-grandma was a Cherokee princess, I couldn't retire, but I could take a nice trip over to Huntsville and go to Dim Sum and then Barnes & Noble. So don't ignore the family stories. In most cases, it's not that people are lying or telling stuff that they deliberately know is not true, but sometimes, as happened in my own family, the traditions kind of got a little bit skewed as they got passed down. So if you can, you want to try to verify them. But do record them. If you've got interesting family stories, definitely write them down. Oral history is important, but not always accurate. And then there are various different forms of evidence. Primary, secondary, and tertiary are good, better, and best. So primary or best evidence is the original document, like your great-grandparents' original marriage license from the courthouse, filled out by the minister or the justice of the peace. Secondary evidence is good evidence, but it's not as good as the primary evidence. For example, a record of the marriage entered into the marriage book later on at the courthouse by a clerk, because that's what they would do. The couple would be issued their marriage license. The ministers and JPs are supposed to return their records after they solemnize the marriages, and then the clerks record all the marriages solemnized in the books. But if you can get that marriage certificate that your great-grandparents got at the time of they file for their marriage license, that's even better than what shows up in the marriage records at the courthouse. Tertiary evidence, or good evidence, is a reference which is used to locate and or relate primary. In other words, it tells you how to find secondary or primary evidence. Like if you had a printed index of marriages in the courthouse, and they do have those in big binders, and we have them on microfilm, or a newspaper list of marriage licenses filed in a county for that month, which they really did like to do in the 19th and all the way up through the mid-20th centuries. So, good, better, and best evidence. And I tried to cover everything in the handout. I may not go into as much detail about some of this stuff just for time. So, if I didn't say something, it should be in the handout. Sources are items that you can touch, like a person, a document, a book, or an artifact. Then there's information, which is based on first-hand, primary, or second-hand, secondary knowledge. Evidence is information that is relevant to a particular research problem or question. Then I'm not going to really say a whole lot about these, but just original versus derivative sources. Original sources are records that contribute written, oral, or visual information that's not derived. It's not gotten from another source or another written or oral record. So I'm not going to say a whole lot about that. The main thing is just to think critically about the records. And one example of a source is this letter to Mrs. Betty Gorman from December 1879. I have that in my archives at home somewhere with my Gorman stuff. An example of primary information would be the marriage license. Actually, this probably would be secondary information because it was, but actually this is signed by the probate judge, so this may actually count as primary. But it's the marriage license of Henry G. Gorman and Virginia Pope, dated December 28th, 1870. So it was recorded by Judge A.W. Ligon. So this probably is primary, but it's the best record I'm probably going to get for that marriage on those people right out of the Colbert County marriage books. And then direct evidence is information that provides an answer, and that answers your question. No further research possible. When did my great-great-grandparents get married? Got the marriage license. Tells me as when the justice solemnized the marriage. No further research needed. Indirect evidence is basically circumstantial evidence. It doesn't really answer your question, but it gives you some pointers. For example, trying to figure out when somebody was born based off their age in the 1860 census. Normally you just subtract their age from 1860. However, a 20-year-old person could have been born in 1839, 1840, or 1841, depending on the actual date of birth, the date the census taker was supposed to, or the date the census was supposed to be taken, and the date the census taker actually appeared, and how the respondent interpreted the census taker's questions. So a lot of people get really upset sometimes about not being able to find out precise birth dates for ancestors. But when you're getting, say, further back than the 1890s, and even in the 1890s sometimes it can be really problematic. But you can usually get, plus or minus 5 years either way. In some cases, you can get exactly right on. But circumstantial evidence doesn't exactly answer your question, which the age in the 1860 census doesn't really answer your question precisely. They're probably close, but not 100%. Now, collateral evidence, did that. Or did I? This is evidence contained in a record which has nothing to do with the purpose for which that record was created. For example, if a man is writing his will and he mentioned that his wife's father gave him a particular parcel of land, this would be collateral evidence for the land because it's actually in the man's will, which is technically not a land record. It would constitute direct evidence of the identity of the man's father-in-law because the man wrote it himself and then had a notary witness it and sign it. And if the will was the original, primary evidence for that relationship, but it would be secondary evidence for the land. It's probably really good secondary evidence or collateral evidence because the guy writing the will knows where his land came from, and generally people don't lie. Certainly if they know they're about to pass away, it usually makes people a little bit more honest, and they don't usually have a reason to lie. Now, example of indirect evidence. This is an interesting case that happened to me. Everyone knew that my great-great-uncle, Miles Freeman, was married twice. His first wife was Dora Kershaw, and his second wife was, I can't remember right now, but he was married twice. And we just assumed that his first wife, Dora Kershaw, had died. But actually, what happened is he divorced her. How I figured that out is I'm going through, and this was before Ancestry was up and really popular. We still had to go through census records on microfilm. So I'm going through the 1910 microfilm by hand, just reading names off, and I see Charlie, I don't know if the pointer will work or not, Charlie and Ida Freeman, anyway, living in the house of John Mobley. And I said, wait a minute, my great-great-uncle Miles had a son and daughter named Charlie and Ida, and his first wife was Dora. And I'm like, okay, she didn't die. I bet they separated. And then I found this notice from the Florence Herald from Friday, 28, 1902, where the East Florence correspondent who signed herself Goldenrod, that wrote the news and gossip from East Florence, wrote, quote, Miles Freeman has gone to parts unknown, leaving a wife and 2 children. So that pretty much cinched in my mind that they had gotten a divorce. Well, it was when I found the divorce decree from the Lauderdale County Circuit Court, there was no question. But you see how I put those different elements together to conclude that why are these 2 kids living with the wrong father, right mother? Well, so nobody in my family had known. Everybody knew Miles was married twice, but nobody had remembered that he divorced his friend. I still don't know exactly why. The marriage license is kind of vague as to the specific reasons. But they did get a divorce. So sometimes you have to sort of put the pieces together like that. The hearsay evidence is evidence which is not based on the witness's personal knowledge, but on information given to him by another source. My grandma said her grandma was a Cherokee. So, again, try to verify it. Now, after you've sort of thought all of this through in your mind and sort of sorted some things out, how do you actually get started putting all this stuff together? One good way is to begin at home. If you have parents, grandparents, aunts, or uncles that are still living, that that their minds are clear and they can remember and they're willing, interview them, tape record them, or film them if they're comfortable with it. Then look for records at home like old family photos, family Bibles, letters, marriage licenses, high school yearbooks, deeds, property abstracts, etc. You know, if you start messing around in your attic or basement, you may find out that you've got more genealogy documents laying around the house than you thought. And number 4, you know, it happens to all of us sooner or later. Be prepared to uncover skeletons in the family closet. Every family has its share of outlaws, illegitimate children, or military deserters, family feuds. So don't let this throw you. If you shake your family tree hard enough, long enough, rotten fruit will fall out somewhere. So don't be embarrassed about something that happened 100 years ago. You weren't there. It's not your fault. But do be aware that some family members, especially of the older generations, but not necessarily, won't want to talk about it. A guy called me in the L building back in 1999 or 2000 from Seattle, Washington. He said, "Can you help me? I'm researching my genealogy and my grandmother refuses to talk about why her grandfather was enumerated in the 1860 Lauderdale County Census with his brother in the county jail." And I said, "I think we can help you." Local genealogist and volunteer at that time, Pat Mahan, said, "Check the Moulton Advertiser for a certain date in 1859. I think there's a murder notice." And sure enough, this guy's ancestors, Dr. Young A. Gray and his brother, were indicted for murder. They were accused of shooting and killing a man named Edwin Lester in Franklin County. And the Florence Gazette actually covered their trial. But his grandmother was so embarrassed by something that happened 100 years ago, she wouldn't talk about it. So we were able to answer his questions, and since then, we have gotten the circuit court record books from the county courthouse, from the circuit court, and I was able to actually look up some of the trial documents. Oops, I didn't finish that. So some people are embarrassed to talk about stuff that happened 100 years ago. So, you know, try to be respectful of their feelings. You know, it may be frustrating sometimes. I'm helping a lady in North Carolina named Keisha, whose cousins have lots of information but don't want to talk about it and won't share it. And she's had some major brick walls that they could help her solve, but they just don't care. So, of course, in our family, me and my dad were working on it while he was still living. We had his cousins, Irma and her sisters, working on it. On my Bratcher side, my dad's cousins, James and Don, are working on it. So we figured, you know, 4 or 5 heads are better than one. So we've got a better chance of solving it. Again, start with you or your parents and work backward a generation at a time. Get copies of your actual documents and then use pedigree charts, ancestry charts, and family group sheets, or get a family tree maker program or something similar, because this really makes it a lot easier to organize your research. This is what the old style charts used to look like that you had to fill in by hand. And I don't know how this worked out, but the males go in the odd numbered blanks and the females go in the males go in the even numbered blanks, and the males go in the odd numbered blanks. So this would be me, Lee Freeman, my father, Bill Freeman, my grandmother, Jeannie Bratcher Freeman, my grandfather, William Allen Freeman, and so on backwards. So this is what one of those looks like from my Freeman family that I've filled out by hand. You notice I don't have nearly all the blanks filled in. Well, that was doing it the old way, which still it's good to go back and do that once in a while, but this is what a blank family group sheet looks like. It has a place for, you do one of these for every marriage that produced offspring. So if you had a great-grandfather that was married 3 times and had kids by each marriage, you got to do one of these for each of the marriages and each of the children. It's got a place to document the parents, their vital information, and then the kids and some of their vital information. And then the good charts will have places at the bottom to document your research. And again, this is a hand chart that I filled in on my third great-grandfather, Isom Freeman, and his wife, Mary H. Jones Freeman. But since Family Tree Maker and other similar programs have come out, you don't really have to write these charts out by hand, and it's really a time saver. You can probably get these at any place that sells software. Like I think we got my dad a copy 15 or 20 years ago at Home Depot, or maybe Office Depot. I don't know if Walmart would have them. I'm sure Ancestry would have it. And they upgrade them every so often, and put out the newest versions. But this is a family group sheet for my second great-grandfather, Wiley Francis Freeman, and his wife, Sarah Frances Wesson, and 4 of their kids. It goes on down. You can add as many kids as they had or that you have records for. And then this is a family group sheet and a descendancy document for the Anthony Brannan family. Anthony Brannan was an African-American Union Civil War vet who's buried in the Bailey Springs AME Church Cemetery or in the Huff Cemetery that's owned by the Bailey Springs AME Church. So they did a family reunion back in 2017, I think, 16 or 17. And so the Lauderdale County Cemetery Rehabilitation Authority, which I'm on, helped them clean up, inventory, and map the cemetery. So I helped them do some of the genealogy research, and I've got this in a Family Tree Maker program. So what I really like about Family Tree Maker is it gives you places to type notes to yourself. Where did I get this information from? Is some of the information I've got conflicting? Why is it conflicting? So you can make notes to yourself and mainly document your research. And you can print it out. And Family Tree Maker will print out, when you get your family tree to the level that you want, you can print it out in different kinds of charts, descendancy charts, those big wheel charts. It'll do several different kinds of charts. You can add photographs and all sorts of stuff like that to it. So, and it's fairly inexpensive, and everybody uses Family Tree Maker or one of the derivatives. This is about the most low-tech, quick, and easy way to organize your paper documents that I've come across. And the late Dr. Darrell Russell, who at the time was president of the Natchez Trace Genealogical Society and a volunteer at the library, taught me this. Just get these cheap plastic binders and plastic sheet protectors. He would do a separate binder for each kind of record for each family, which that's a lot of binders. So like his Russells, he would do one binder of marriages, one binder of deaths, one binder of census records. That's a lot of binders. So I don't put mine in different binders because I don't have quite as many record documents as he did, but I do use these plastic documents. So this is an easy way that you can organize your documents. You may want to put a descendancy chart from Family Tree Maker that you've typed up in the beginning with family group sheets for each family, just as sort of an index for the records that you've got on those families. But this is a quick and easy way to organize. I forgot to bring one of mine. I might have one over there, but that's all right. And you can get those binders at Walmart for like $2.99 or something. Well, we're going to talk about some of the good online resources that you can access at the library and family search you can do from home. The library has subscription services to several of these. These are free sites, which are really good, and they'll be in the handout of good free genealogy sites. Then the library has subscriptions to these. Let's see if I didn't put newspapers.com on there, but we've also got a newspapers.com subscription that we will be talking about later.
I'm not familiar with that program, Greenwood.
It's really good for military service records and records that have to do with the military. They got a really good Civil War collection. But they've also got some census records and other records, Revolutionary War, Civil War, some World War II. They're going along, adding more stuff as they go, but there's a lot of records out there, so it takes a while to get everything uploaded. What I use them for mainly is Civil War service records, Union and Confederate. They've got probably half the Union records and all of the Confederate records. They've got the Southern Claim Petition files on there. Really good. I also listed these 3 books. I couldn't find the red book because I was in a hurry coming over here. But 3 books, if you can get them, no genealogy should be without, because they really help you to do research. They're just pretty much like genealogist Bibles that you can look up quick information if you need to know when did Texas start keeping vital records. And just look in the red book under Texas, and it will tell you when Texas started keeping vital records and what years they are available from. The source book is just a detailed how-to guide to genealogy, and it's like 500 pages long or more. And if anybody wants to look at these when we're done. And then the handy book is similar to the red book. The red book's a little bit better in my opinion. And then Map Guide to the U.S. Federal Censuses breaks down, it goes year by year from 1790 to 1920 and talks about how the county boundaries in each different state in the Union changed. And why this is important is because I get people all the time saying, I can't find my grandpa in Colbert County in 1850. And I know he was there. I'm like, because Colbert County didn't exist in 1850. It separated from Franklin in 1867, and it was official by 1870. So this helps you know, well, if I can't find my ancestor in the county I've been looking for, maybe that county was formed from a parent county. So that can be really helpful. And these are just some of the genealogy records that you'll be looking at as you do genealogy. Population censuses, slave censuses, state population censuses, family Bible records, vital records. We were talking about church records before. But the main ones we're going to be talking about in this series today are census records, vital records, probate records, land records, and military records. So, census records. And this is Keanu Reeves, a meme for Keanu Reeves. What if the people asking ASL on Omegle are actually census takers counting the world population? He's one of my favorite actors, and Omegle was a social networking site, similar to Facebook and some of those other sites, where you could make friends across the country or across the world. But users would ask ASL, what's your age, what's your sex, and what's your location? Well, I'm 52, my name is Lee Freeman, I live in Florence, Alabama. But what if the people asking ASL on Omegle are actually census takers at counting the world population? I thought that was cute, but I'm apparently the only one. That's all right. Well, these are examples of census records. The 1790 census, which these original censuses were hand-drawn by these census enumerators. They didn't have these nice printed sheets for another 30 or 40 years after this. 20 or 30 years after this, at least. And initially, censuses were taken from house to house, door to door, by enumerators. U.S. federal censuses are available. Let me go back first. U.S. federal censuses are available from 1790 to 1940, and they call them censuses from the Latin for 10. Cen means 10. So they're available from 1790 to 1940. The 1950 should come out on April 1st, 2022, because the government won't release census records for 72 years for privacy reasons. Now, it could be worse. In the UK, they won't release census records for 100 years. So they just got their 1911 just a few years ago. There are only fragments left of the 1890 census. It was being stored at the Commerce Department in 1921 when a fire broke out in the basement, causing the sprinkler system to kick on, which soaked the sheets, most of which were discarded because they didn't really know how to conserve water-damaged paper material at that time. So Congress just threw them out, or the Commerce Department, rather, just threw them out. Only they managed to save some fragments of some counties of some states, but only part of Perry County survives for Alabama. So, and that's the hinge year everybody would love to have for whatever reason. So census takers like Mr. Seymour Weiss, who took the census in a practice run federal census in Indiana in 1939, went from house to house in their different enumerator districts, asking questions of heads of families and writing the answers down in the big ledger books. If the head of the family, usually the husband or father, was not home, the enumerator is supposed to come back and ask that person. But they might ask the wife or whoever they could find. One of the kids, it might be a neighbor, to answer his or her questions. Thus, some of the data for some families will just be wrong. There's no other way to say it. Families often got skipped if they weren't home or wouldn't come to the door to answer the questions. Until 1880, there were 3 copies made of a census every 10 years. They had the local copy, the census taker did by hand. Then they copied a state copy, and then they made a copy on the federal level. The federal copies of what have been microfilmed and digitized. When making these other transcriptions, sometimes information was recorded incorrectly or families got skipped, often whole sections. There is a section of the Lauderdale County 1870 federal census that has my second great grandparents, among a lot of other families, that is not in the 1870 federal census that has been microfilmed. But the Alabama Department of Archives and History has the state copy, which I think may have my ancestors and those other ones that got skipped in them. So be aware of that. Censuses are really good basic genealogy documents, but read them a little bit carefully. And of course, this is how they took the census until probably the 1970s or 80s. Now they send out those mailers, and you can do it online. So you can see, census takers were supposed to be the most educated people that they could find, but nevertheless, they were hooked on phonics in many cases, as you can see from this humorous slide from the Natchez Straits newsletter. Occupation: census taker. I'm a census taker for the city of Buffalo. Our city has grown very fast in recent years, so they're spelling it phonetically. So this is a real-life example of hooked on phonics in 1850 for my 4th great-grandfather, Joseph Imes. The way the family spelled it, the Alabama family, is I-J-A-M-S. It's pronounced Imes. They came from Cornwall in the UK in 1665. Well, the census taker spelled it phonetically as Imes, which that's the way he heard it, and it makes perfect sense if you don't know the traditional spelling. Henry Simmons in 1850, a creative census taker that knows that C sometimes makes the same sound as S does, spelled Simmons with a C. S-I-M-M-O-N-S. The Ancestry's computer recognition software read it as Simmons with an A. So always check for spelling variations. And when we talk about a family search in Ancestry and these other sites, it allows you to check for misspelled names. It's very important. You can never assume that they spelled the name right. As you can see, with a simple name like Kennedy, you can do a lot of weird stuff with it. And I have seen all of these variations in Lauderdale County records. Jordan may have some Kennedys, I don't know, in his family tree, but they're a very prominent East Lauderdale family, but it's spelled 9 different ways, depending on the census taker or county courthouse clerk and how careful he is to spell it correctly. And until probably the mid-19th century, there wasn't really spelling standardization anyway. I'm told that there were 8 correct ways of spelling Shakespeare's last name in the 1580s, and they're all grammatically correct because there was no spelling standardization. But even after there was, census takers are hooked on phonics. Well, this is should be 1790 Rowan County. Antebellum censuses only recorded the names of free householders, white and black. Until 1850, only heads of families were recorded by name. Everybody else got listed in age brackets, 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, etc., in columns for males and females. So don't skip these. Some people tend to just skip these because they think they're a little bit too hard to figure out, but they're really not if you do it a little bit. Beginning on 1850, June 1st, 1850, U.S. censuses recorded the name, sex, and age of every free person, black and white, in the U.S. They also listed the territory or state of birth of a person, as well as whether couples were married within that census year, which was July 1849 to June 30th, 1850. They also listed the value of their real estate, that they owned, their profession of each person that had a job. You can see William Freeman was a miller. You may not be able to read that. And any persons over 20 who couldn't read or write, and I think William couldn't read or write. It also recorded deaf, dumb, or insane persons. They did not use more politically correct terminology back then. Slaves were enumerated by sex and race, black, mulatto, Creole, etc., under their owners' names in a separate slave schedule. So this is an example from 1850 to, I believe, 1940 of how detailed the categories of information got. You can see this is pretty big print, not a lot of categories. Then by 1910 and in 1940, they had this category at the top. Some of the people, they randomly asked supplemental questions of anybody on certain lines. In 1940, they would ask supplemental questions of those people. And 1940 really focused in on Works Project Administration jobs because FDR wanted to bolster the federal government and its public image and his programs under the New Deal. So they really focused on New Deal projects. But you can see how technical they got as they went along. The 1840 census recorded Revolutionary War military pensions, and as censuses progressed from 1850, more and more information was recorded. Like by 1880, they're listing the relationship to the head of the family of everybody in that house, whether wife, husband, daughter, cousin, uncle. By 1900, they were recording whether a person had become a naturalized citizen and when they did so, where they were from. But in 1900 and 1910, they asked how many children a woman had total, and then how many children were still living at the time of the 1900 and 1910 censuses. So if you're wondering whether your ancestors may have had more children that you can't account for in records, the 1900 and 1910 may fill in those gaps. Sometimes people got enumerated twice. My great-great-aunt, one of Wiley Francis Freeman's daughters, got enumerated at home with her parents in, I believe, 1910. Then she got a job with the phone company a couple of days later, moved into an apartment, and then got enumerated in her second new residence, which is what the census taker is supposed to do. She's living in that house when he gets there, so he's supposed to record everybody that lives in that house. But she got recorded twice. So that can happen in some cases. So I mentioned slave census schedules. This really applies to African Americans. However, I like to collect these, and I did unfortunately have some ancestors that were slave owners. So I like to try to research the slaves that they had, and if I can, find out a little bit about the slaves that they had. But these are available for 1850 and 60 in the antebellum slave states, which included places like Maryland, Kentucky, that eventually either stayed neutral or sided with the Union. They were considered part of the South, so they took slave censuses. And then the bottom one is part of the 1870 Mortality Schedule, which is at the same time the census taker did the population schedule, they took agricultural schedules, industrial censuses, mortality schedules, censuses of blind, deaf, and insane people. And this is from the mortality schedule where they recorded all the deaths in a given county of a given state for that census year. So if you can't find a death record on an ancestor, and for those early years, this can help. But this is only for between 1850 and 1880. I think they made them took them for 1900, but the government chucked them out. So they're only available on Ancestry from 1850 to 1880, but they can be useful. Now we're going to talk a little bit about land records. I've got to hurry this along. And I'm only going to try to restrict this to the kinds of records that you can readily get on Ancestry and Family Search. Well, in Europe and in the original 13 colonies, land was apportioned via the metes and bounds system. And this basically described property lines based on local markers and bounds drawn by humans, often based on topography, like as you can see maybe in the slide, and I think I've got it reproduced in your handout. Great white oak, felled maple, marked oak, Jones Smith corner, designated marker, Simpson Creek, What if the creek changes course? Well, this was the 13 original colonies, but President Thomas Jefferson came up with a rectangular survey system of 785, and man, it makes, because I'm not a math geek, as Mrs. Stewart can tell you, so this makes land transactions so much easier, and it's all based on squares and rectangles. But the 30 public domain or public land states, basically any state that wasn't one of the 13 original colonies, is a public domain or public land state. And Ancestry and Folklore have some of their records online. And as hopefully this slide from Lauderdale County will emphasize, it just goes, the ranges go across, the townships go down. Huntsville is what's called the prime meridian. It's the land center for North Alabama. Everything east of Huntsville is east. Everything west of Huntsville is west. In Lauderdale County, it goes from range 7 all the way to range 16, right on the border of the Tennessee River, and then you're in Mississippi. The townships go down. So in Lauderdale County, they go from township 3, 2, and 1. Simple, basic math, because otherwise I couldn't do it. And you can see how they're just broken down into squares and rectangles and smaller squares and rectangles. But there's a nomenclature, a way of describing them. So, let's see if I can get the order to work again. Nope. This would be the northwest quarter. This would be the northeast quarter. This would be the southwest quarter. This would be the southeast quarter. And you can see how you just break it into smaller and smaller sections, or smaller and smaller units. It looks hard at first, but after you do it a couple times, it really is simple. And it's way easier than the meets and bounds. One of Dr. Russell's class projects was to do a meets and bounds deed, and with protractors trace out the property. And I don't think anybody ever got it completely right. And there should be a caption for this. Okay, here we go. Now, Ancestry has some of these records online. These are for land records of the public land survey system, which is a survey method used historically over the largest fraction of the U.S. to survey and spatially identify land parcels before the designation of eventual ownership. Much of the actual surveying was done in the 19th century under a contract system by the General Land Office, or GLO, which was created in 1812. Now it's the Bureau of Land Management that handles this kind of stuff. The system was originally created and proposed by Thomas Jefferson shortly after the American Revolution with the passing of the Land Ordinance of 1785. The Continental Congress passed the ordinance, then the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. And so after the land was surveyed and could then be legally described, they set up a land office, which, as I said, in our area is Huntsville. Then an auction was held, and land became available to claimants or entrymen who before 1820 paid a credit installment or a down payment on a cash purchase. However, applicants could also obtain land through a variety of congressional acts which allowed for preemption. Well, there were various different ways they could dispose of the land after they got it, which will be in your handout. I'm not going to go over the details of some of this, just to save some time. Each land office was administered jointly by two officials, a registrar who recorded entries and kept track of which tracts were claimed are still open, and a receiver who actually handled the money. They kept journals and ledgers. The local land office also kept a separate file, and we have the tract book for Lauderdale County at the courthouse. And some of these are on the Bureau of Land Management website, some of the actual tract books. From the local point, initial point, we talked about this as another, which I forgot I'll put in here. This is a military warrant. This is basically where, for military veterans, for certain wars in certain years, rather than pay out pension money, they paid them with land. So if you had a Revolutionary War ancestor, or an ancestor that served in one of the Indian Wars, or the War of 1812, they may have applied and received a bounty land warrant. This is for Darius Butler, who received warrant number 12583 for 80 acres in Lauderdale County. This doesn't tell you much about his military service, just that he was a private in Captain Hogg's company, 1st Regiment North Carolina Militia, and that he basically had to prove to the government's satisfaction that he was a veteran in good standing and entitled to bounty land. So that may help if you find a bounty land warrant for an ancestor, that means he served. They may have applied and been rejected. My third great grandmother Mary got rejected for some reason. This is David R. Campbell's homestead certificate. And that was a land deal that the federal government came up with under Abraham Lincoln in 1862, which became effective on January 1st, 1873, providing for the taking up of 1/4 section or less of unappropriated public lands. I didn't really skip that. By anyone meeting the following requirements. They had to be head of a family, at least 21 years old, had to be a U.S. citizen. They had to have never taken up arms against the U.S. government, so no Confederates or former Confederates need apply. And they had to use the land for the purpose of actual settlement or cultivation. They could enter the land upon payment of $10, and no lands acquired under the provisions of the Act could in any event become liable. So you may have an ancestor that applied for land under the Homestead Act, and Ancestry has some of these records. Well, I want to talk briefly, very briefly, about using vital records. Ancestry and Folklore have various types of vital records. And vital records are some of the single most important genealogical records you can get because they provide basic information about genealogical events, the births, marriages, and deaths. And I won't talk a lot about divorce records, but they are also considered vital records. Ancestry does have some divorce records or indexes to divorce records online. Prior to the 19th century in Europe, vital records, which are birth, marriage, divorce, and death, were typically kept by the churches on the parish level within a given county of a European country. In the 19th century, England and other European countries initiated national registration systems. However, in the U.S., this didn't really catch on until 1900, and in the U.S., the task of registering births, deaths, and marriages was left up to each individual state, which accounts for their different dates and regulations regarding the keeping of vital records. Some cities began keeping records before their states. Alabama began requiring state registration of vital records only in 1908, and registration was spotty for the first 20 years or so. Prior to the 19th century, birth records were generally kept by the churches at the parish level, with American colonial churches continuing the custom. Often, ministers and priests were required to report births and christenings to the civil authorities. In these areas, there might be both ecclesiastical and civil records of births and christenings, so you may have to check on both or may want to check on both. And Ancestry and Family Search have some of these European records as well. The earliest U.S. cities to call for civil registration of births were New Orleans in 1790, Boston in 1848, Philadelphia in 1860, Pittsburgh in 1870, and Baltimore in 1875. And again, keeping births and other vital records on the state level generally happened after 1900. And due to privacy and identity theft issues in Alabama, birth certificates less than 125 years old are restricted to that person or their next of kin. So you'll have to prove that you are that person's next of kin. Well, Ancestry has and Family Search have some marriage records from some states due to licensing agreements and other concerns with the different counties and states. They don't have all the records from everywhere, but they do have some of the Lawrence County, Tennessee marriages for my great-great-great-grandfather Charles Joel Heron and his third wife. They've got 2 or 3 of his marriages from Lawrence County, Tennessee on there. Then death certificates, as I said, generally start after the 20th century. And these are the dates of some of the major states and when they started keeping records and when they are available online. This should also be in your handout. You can see that Mississippi didn't start till 1914. I think South Carolina didn't start till 1915. And for some states like Arkansas, they have big gaps in the records of what's available. So this is what a death certificate looks like. Let's see. And this is a death certificate for Mrs. Phoebe Smith, and you can see that the they've spelled her name phonetically as Phoebe, F-E-B-I-E, instead of correctly F-P-H-O-E-B-E, and the Ancestry computer recognition software read it as Felice Smith. So the Ancestry character recognition software, or in this case Family Search, sometimes has a hard time of making these out. Well, these can be good. They're especially good for the person and their death date. Because the information, the other information is based on an informant, it's secondary information. It's not as good as primary because in this case, her husband, Albert Smith, was the informant. So it lists her name and her date of death, then the husband's name, and then it lists her parents, who were Dave Barnett of Lauderdale County and Annie Thompson of Lauderdale County. And I've checked these records, and Albert got it exactly right. And he, as the head of the household, or her husband, he was in a better position to know who her parents were than other people would be. But sometimes if the informant is the undertaker or the physician that tended the person when they were sick, you just got to try to verify whether some of this other information is correct. Another type of generally easily obtainable death records are obituaries and death notices. This is one for an African-American man named Fount Turpin from Saturday, November 27th, 1880, from newspaperscom. And they do have several local titles for Florence and, for Lauderdale and Colbert counties online. Prior to the Civil War, many newspapers were weekly, published once a week, and were normally only 4 pages long, with much space being devoted to advertising. So typically only prominent or well-to-do residents would have obituaries or death notices. This tended to change after the Civil War, and they started to record deaths of more and more what you might call ordinary people, like my ancestors in this Fount Turpin. Now, sometimes they'll just have a death notice, often written by the newspaper. In some cases, they'll have a full-blown obituary, which was usually written by a family member or a pastor maybe, or a cousin even. This is for Russellville, Alabama resident Irish immigrant James Gorman's 1841 obituary from the Tuscumbia, Alabama, North Alabamian. And he gives a little bit of good information that he was age 24, a native of Tipperary County, Ireland, which was very good to know, and for many years a resident of this county. But then they spend the rest of the obituary talking about what a fine Christian, upstanding man he was. And I guess that's good to know, but I wish they had told who his father was. If he was married, what was his wife's name? I don't think he was married. I think he was too young. But anyway, how much information you actually get in obituaries can depend on who writes them and who can give information. Many areas had more than one paper publishing at a time, with some areas like Florence and Tuscumbia also boasting African American newspapers. Some larger cities like New York or Chicago also boasted Jewish, German, Italian, Polish newspapers. So be sure to try and check all of the available local papers for an obituary or death notice. If your ancestor was African American, check both the African American and the white papers. Local papers were often on exchanges with each other. So the Florence papers would subscribe to papers from Memphis, Nashville, Sheffield, Tuscumbia, Huntsville, Athens. So you might want to check those, especially for dates where we don't have a date for a local newspaper. Then check Athens or Huntsville. If they were prominent enough known, they might have gotten written up. Newspapers.com has several local newspapers online, and then in about 2 minutes or less, I want to briefly talk about military service records. So the handout goes into a lot more detail. I probably went overkill, but these are the wars. Some of the wars Americans have. So these are just the main ones Americans have served in, and this is listed in the handout. Some of the types of military records are service records, bounty land warrants, which we briefly talked about, Civil War veteran censuses, pension files, draft registration cards. So this is an early type of military service record. The Revolutionary War service record for Mr. Agrippa Hull, who was a freedman from Massachusetts who served with George Washington and General Kosciuszko in the Revolutionary War. And I'd really like to read up on him sometime because he seems like a really interesting figure. So his records are available online. I don't remember. I think I probably got those off of Fold 3. Then Civil War records. This is some cards from Francis Marion Hollis's Company B, 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry Service records. He was my 3rd great grandmother on my mother's side, who started out in Wayne County and winded up in Lawrence County. Union service records generally contain enlistment papers, muster rolls, prisoner of war papers, death reports, etc. They usually give a physical description of the soldier, his height, weight, eye color, etc. Usually, but not always. They don't always have enlistment papers. Union service records are kept at the National Archives. Fold 3 has service records from about half the Union Army and all of the Confederate states. Ancestry has indexes to records on Fold 3. Civil War records don't usually contain any information regarding a soldier's family unless he was killed or something in the service. They are only interested in his military service. The 1910 census reported the survivors of the Union and Confederate Army and Navy. The 1930 census also listed Civil War veterans, and the slide is a sample of a man's enlistment papers. Lauderdale County slave in Richmond, Virginia native Charles Ingram, who ran away from the Ingram plantation and enlisted in Company H of the 111th United States Colored Troops, and his service records are available on Fold 3. Confederate service records, because of the way they kept them, were generally only compiled beginning in 1903 from various and sundry sources, including the centralized military personnel records, which were turned over to the federal government by Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. The compiled service record of a Confederate soldier will consist of one or more card abstracts and often one or more original documents like pay vouchers, requisition forms. Each card in a man's file is abstracted from original records, such as Confederate muster rolls, etc. The Confederates didn't keep records nearly as good as the Union Army did, so some guys that served don't even have service records. Some guys might only have one card or 2 cards that doesn't really say a whole lot, so just be aware of that. Then we're going to skip up to World War I. Most of the World War I and World War II records were destroyed in a fire in St. Louis in 1973. So millions of these records got destroyed, which is unfortunate because those records are restricted for 62 years for privacy reasons to anybody but the veteran or his next of kin. So the restriction is up on the World War II records, but most of them got burned up in a fire for World War I and World War II. In some cases, the federal government can reconstruct your ancestors' records from secondary documents. 80% of the Army records from 1912 to 1960 and 75% of the Air Force records to 1947 to 64 were destroyed. But don't despair, because sometimes you'll find a draft registration card for an ancestor, as I did for my grandfather, William Allen Freeman right here. He served in France as a medic at a field hospital, and I've got his draft registration card and his discharge papers from the county courthouse, which are not, I believe, on Ancestry. But the draft registration cards are. They give you the soldier's name, his residence, his birth date, which is usually given by the soldier himself. So these tend to be a little more reliable. They give you his occupation, if he's married, the name of his wife, or the next of kin where he can be reached, which often, in William's case, he wasn't married yet. So it lists his mother, I believe. So those can be helpful, and they have those for African American draftees, Chinese draftees, Mexican American draftees, everybody else. Some veterans for some wars qualified for pensions where the government paid them for military service. They had to meet certain eligibility requirements, go before the pension examiner, so they didn't just automatically hand out money. So this is the pension file, part of the pension file for my 5th great grandfather, Vatchel Imes, who served in Maryland and North Carolina regiments during the Revolutionary War. And what's cool about his file is it actually contains his will, which I have not been able to find in the Lauderdale County Courthouse records, but it is in his pension application file. So you never know what they might have stuck in someone's pension application file. either the veteran, his widow, or somebody litigating on his behalf to help him get his pension. Sometimes they'll include family Bible records in pension application files to help prove that the guy served and is who he says he is and available for a pension. And of course, after the Civil War, both the Union and Confederate states awarded pensions, since the Confederate states were considered to be in rebellion against the federal government. They made the former Confederate states pay out their pensions from the individual state treasuries, while the feds paid all the Union veterans. But Ancestry has some of the Confederate widows' pension application files. So this is a couple of pages from my third great-grandmother, Mrs. Molly Gorman Nance of Russellville, Alabama, whose husband was killed in a freak accident in 1903. He had served in Roddy's 4th Alabama Cavalry, and she received a pension after his death. And basically, she's got to prove to the government's satisfaction that she is who she says she is. So it'll give her name, her birth date, when they got married, where they got married, if they have any children, what their children's names are, his military service, like he served in Roddy's 4th Alabama, etc. So she could apply and not receive one. So even if they didn't receive a pension, it's still worth checking to see if anybody applied. There were several different classes of pensioners in Alabama, and to get money, you had to fit certain criteria. So again, the Confederate government's not just handing out, or the state governments are not just handing out money either. Then some of the Confederate states did veteran censuses of Confederate veterans. Lauderdale County, or Alabama, did in 1907, then again in 1931, and a third time in the 1930s. Ancestry has 1907 and 1921. So if you can't find service records on a guy, any veteran that was living in 1907 who had served in a Confederate regiment, he was living in Lauderdale County, but he had served out of Wayne County, but he went to the Lauderdale County Courthouse to register. So they skipped a lot of guys who never went in to register. In some cases, they might have mistakenly recorded some Union veterans that didn't know they weren't supposed to go in. So this will at least give you the man's name, his birth date, his birthplace, and when and where he enlisted, and his company and regiment, and when he was mustered out. And then the Union government in 1890 recorded Union veterans in several different states. This is John Bell Hollis's Wayne County 1890 Union Veterans Enumeration. It records his name, that he was a sergeant in Company B, 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry, USA, which was a Union regiment, and then it has his muster in and muster out dates. So that is a very whirlwind examination of getting started and the basic records